Black Waitress serves the deaf grandmother of a millionaire. Her secret left everyone speechless. It began in a room that believed itself to be important. Gold-lit ceilings sighed over marble floors. Glass chimed softly. Coats whispered as they slid from shoulders. Every ritual was polished, every smile rehearsed. It was the kind of place that knew the price of everything and the cost of nothing, where excellence was claimed rather than proven. In the back corridors where the light did not reach and praise did not wander, a young woman balanced plates, learned silence, and carried a private language in her fingers that the room had never bothered to imagine. She had worked her way up from steam and soap, through the long fog of dishwater shifts, into a space where she could at least see the chandeliers rather than only hear them. She carried more than a tray. She carried the weight of many quiet midnights, a sibling who needed her, a ledger of sacrifices no one else would read, an education on pause, a faith in work that kept folding and unfolding like napkins, clean and precise. She had learned endurance the way some learn piano, by repetition, by ear, by heart. The first test came the way cruelty often arrives, casually with a curl at the edge of a mouth. A superior decided that some tables were not meant for some hands. The words landed like broken porcelain at the woman's feet, sharp and unnecessary. The room pretended not to hear. The kitchen pretended not to see. But arrogance has a funny habit of marking itself for future inventory, and the woman quietly took note. She understood that disrespect was a ledger too, and that every line would matter later. That night, the most watched corner of the dining room was reserved for a family with a name that made headlines behave. The heir sat with the posture of inherited comfort. Beside him, the life partner whose gaze flickered between a glowing phone and an untouched glass. Across from them, the person who mattered most and was seen least, a grandmother, elegant and alert, her ears closed to the noise of the world, her eyes open to its movement. The room swayed around them. Waiters poured, laughter breezed. The orchestra of privilege tuned itself as always. The young woman stepped to the table with a stillness she had practiced for years. The heir nodded without interest. The partner issued requests without looking up. The grandmother studied the woman, searching not for sound but for presence. And then, as gently as a key finding its lock, hands began to speak. The waitress lifted her fingers into the air and shaped meaning the way a sculptor shapes air into form. A greeting first, then a question, then an invitation to choose, to be asked, to be seen. In that instant, a lifetime of being spoken around dissolved. The grandmother's face changed the way dawn changes a room. A language that had been boxed and stored in the quiet corners of her life suddenly stood in the center and took a bow. She responded with hands that had learned to tell stories without sound. She laughed without a voice, and the entire table felt it. The heir's posture altered. The partner lowered the phone. Strangers across the room pause, sensing something sacred and rare. The moment when a person shifts from furniture to human in the eyes of those who claim to love them. Service transformed from transaction to bridge. The woman translated the menu with grace and precision, not as a novelty, but as a respect that should have been ordinary. She fielded glances and questions and gratitude with the ease of someone who has been underestimated long enough to render it boring. For 1 hour, perhaps two, a small miracle repeated itself with every course. A grandmother was not managed, she was met. Not everyone welcomed the miracle. From the shadowed mouth of the kitchen, resentment watched. There are minds that fear what they do not control and bruise what they cannot understand. A manager measured authority the way some measure weather, by how many people needed umbrellas when she walked by. She had built a little kingdom of schedules and scoldings, and used it to remind certain workers of where she believed they belonged. That night the kingdom felt smaller. Recognition had slipped from her fingers and landed in other hands, and jealousy, very old, very practiced, stirred awake. After the last plates had cleared and the last compliments had been offered, the reckoning arrived in a cramped office with bad lighting. The manager spoke in the cool tone of someone who mistakes cruelty for competence. New schedules appeared, designed not to optimize service but to punish hope. Promises about demotions and doors that would remain closed. Warnings dressed as advice. Hints about a sister who needed care. and what might happen if employment wobbled. The message was simple: know your place or lose your footing. The woman did not argue. She did what those who navigate hostile systems learn to do. She remembered. She documented. She cataloged precise words, dates, hours, decisions, the canonical records of 1,000 small violences that are often dismissed as misunderstandings when daylight comes. She preserved tone. She preserved context. She preserved the formula of harm so there would be no room left for denial later. Experience had taught her that rage is a spark and proof is a fuse. At dawn, fate parked a black car by the employee entrance. The heir had not slept much. The previous evening had rearranged something in him. It had widened his architecture for what attentiveness could be. He had watched his grandmother glow, and glow is a powerful instructor. He waited near the service door because that is where gratitude should go, back to the place where effort begins. The conversation that followed did not need to be quoted to be felt. An offer emerged, clean and fair. A path appeared, dignified and direct. There was still a workplace to respect, notice periods to honor, bridges to leave standing. But there was also clarity. Some talents do not belong in the shadows. Some contributions demand a broader stage. The woman tucked a simple card into her pocket and exhaled. Not relief, readiness. The manager did not adjust. Some people doubled down when they should step back. The punishments hardened. The morning shifts bled into each other. Opportunities were blocked with smiles. The message grew sharper, but the woman's planning also sharpened. Every missing tip, every selectively enforced rule, every schedule bent to disadvantage certain staff while protecting others, every disparaging remark, every time the word protocol was used to protect power rather than guests. Everything entered the record that would one day have a room full of witnesses. The day of unraveling arrived with the quiet inevitability of a tide. The investor walked through the front door, not as a patron this time, but as a stakeholder who had been paying for excellence in receiving theater. Questions were asked in a voice that brooked no shorthand. Answers were offered, brittle and evasive. The phrase that betrays every prejudice slid out, the one that sorts people by class and color and calls it policy. And then the phone on which truth had been so carefully harvested finally spoke. There is a silence that follows a recording like that, a silence loud with recognition. Not the realization that someone will lose a job. That is too small. The larger recognition is this: a culture has been documented, a posture has been named, an architecture of harm has been measured in its own units. And because it has been measured, it can be changed. Terminations are swift when money and morals agree. Partnerships dissolve. Keys change hands. Whisper networks run out of oxygen. And in a corner of the kitchen where steam once fogged the air, a handful of line cooks and bussers share glances that look like sunrise. The bully has finally met a wall. The target has finally found a megaphone. The institution has finally noticed that the cost of looking away exceeded the price of doing right. The woman did not stand in the middle of the dining room for a bow. She did not need the room to clap. She had work to do, and it was work that would turn a single night into a new normal. She transitioned to a role where inclusion was not a favor, but a system. She took the skills she had honed in chaos and repurposed them for design. Training modules appeared not as slideshows, but as experiences that rewired habits. Hands across the hospitality chain learned to speak. Eyes learn to land where deafness requires them to land. Hosts learn to ask questions with their faces. Chefs learn to plate information as thoughtfully as they plated food. Front desks across a dozen cities stopped being counters and became bridges. The grandmother at the heart of it all attended the first celebration, hands alive with gratitude, eyes bright with belonging. She was not a guest that night. She was the thesis. She watched 100 employees practice their letters and their patience. She watched 1,000 guests in the months that followed experience what she experienced. A world rebuilt to meet them halfway. She watched a young woman who once washed dishes rewrite the expectations of an entire industry without raising her voice. Meanwhile, far from the golden room, the former manager learned the cost of forgetting that phones remember and people talk. Resumes began to bounce. Interviews shrank. Search results told stories that no reference could override. It is one thing to fall, it is another to learn. The hope is always that consequence becomes curriculum. Whether it did in this case is a question only the person in the mirror can answer. The woman carried on. She expanded the program beyond one chain, then beyond one city, then beyond one sector. She built a registry of interpreters who could be summoned as easily as a dessert cart. She mapped elevators and sight lines and lighting so that faces would not blur and hands would not disappear into shadow. She rewrote scripts for customer service, replacing apologies with accommodations and pity with parody. She turned feedback into software updates and criticism into curriculum. She invited the deaf community to lead the design, not merely sign off on it. Her sister watched from the front row as opportunity finally arrived on time instead of late. Scholarships made the future less expensive. Classes became possible. An apartment with sunlight became home. For the first time, the woman felt the odd sensation of a plan exceeding its original size without exceeding its soul. Awards tried to find her. Magazine covers tried to frame her. She accepted what would help the work and quietly declined what would distract from it. She knew that applause is a sugar that tires the heart. She preferred fiber, the unglamorous nourishment of policies updated, budgets approved, managers retrained, lawsuits avoided because problems never formed. She understood that the best evidence of change is not a speech. It is a bored guest who never has to think about whether a restaurant knows how to look them in the eyes. If you listen carefully to the heartbeat of this story, you will hear more than triumph. You will hear process. A teenager learning to memorize files because systems forget people. A young adult choosing to be meticulous rather than dramatic. An employee declining to return insult for insult and choosing instead to collect what courts and boards understand: facts. A professional deciding to build something so useful that even her former critics would one day rely on it. You will also hear a warning to every room that crowns itself with chandeliers and convinces itself that those below the lights do not see. The people who carry your plates carry your truth. Treat them as invisible, and they will one day show you what you refuse to see. Treat them as essential, and you will never need a scandal to teach you manners. In time, the inaugural gala of a new tradition filled a hall with the kind of brightness that isn't for show. Hands flickered across the audience like birds. Voices narrated, and hands echoed, and the two together made a music that felt like justice. The grandmother, regal and radiant, watched as a world bent toward her at last. The air stood and clapped long after others had stopped, because some gratitude cannot find enough air. A sibling waved from a balcony seat, proud and teary, knowing more than anyone what this night cost and what it purchased for those who will come after. Across town, in a smaller space with a cheaper light, a laptop streamed the event. Consequence can be cruel if it teaches nothing. It can also be the beginning of wisdom. The person watching had a choice to make: resentment or repair. The stream did not care which choice would be made. The work on the stage would continue either way. The narrator of this story, this tired city, this industry that likes to brag about service while too often forgetting whom it serves, leans in close now to whisper the only moral worth keeping. The point was never to break a person who broke others. The point was to end a pattern. The point was to make it impossible, or at least expensive, to confuse hierarchy with excellence again. The point was to replace the brittle currency of gatekeeping with the durable wealth of inclusion. Some endings arrive as applause. This one arrives as infrastructure. In this ending, schedules bend toward fairness without requiring heroism. In this ending, job descriptions include fluency not only in food, but in humanity. In this ending, managers learn that authority is stewardship, not spectacle. In this ending, the person who once kept a family apart during dinner now teaches families to stay together, while meals and years in health come and go. In this ending, a waitress is not a role, but a chapter title. And the book is about the country we are building when we finally decide to stop mistranslating each other. There will be other rooms. Other chandeliers will shine. Other mouths will form old words about who belongs where. Let them, because somewhere in those rooms, someone will lift their hands and speak with light. Someone will turn a menu into a bridge. Someone who was supposed to stay invisible will illuminate the entire floor. And when that happens, let the memory of the story tap each shoulder in the room and remind it what to do. Not to clap the loudest, to change the rules. The woman who once scrubbed plates taught an industry to see. She taught a family to listen. She taught a town that dignity is not granted by the powerful. It arises in the one who refuses to drop the tray when the room gets loud. She taught all of us that a secret is not always a hidden shame. Sometimes it is a language waiting for the right audience. Sometimes it is a plan waiting for the right hour. Sometimes it is a hand that can turn noise into understanding, exclusion into design, and pain into a policy manual. The light fades on the gala. The kitchen closes on time. The new schedules are fair. The grandmother goes home tired and alive in the way only inclusion makes you alive. The heir sleeps well for reasons he finally respects. The sibling studies late into the night, building a future on a foundation that holds. The former manager sits with a mirror and a choice, and the woman whose hands began it all wakes before dawn, not to scrub, but to lead. She makes coffee. She reviews training plans. She calls 3 hotels in 3 different time zones and answers the same question with the same care. She ties her hair, not for heat, but for habit. She watches the sun catch on a city of glass and decides, as she always has, to build. Because the lesson that outlasts any scandal is simple. You cannot silence what has learned another way to speak. And the justice worth chasing is not a viral moment. It is 1,000 ordinary days in which every guest belongs. Every worker is protected, and every hand, whether signing or serving, knows it is part of something that finally makes sense.